Cities can't print their own money, and cities can't spend more money than they collect. Cities also can't borrow money without voter approval. City governments exist to provide the services and organization that residents demand from them. They provide police, fire, and school departments. They pave roads and they pick up your trash. How do cities pay for public buildings, pave roads, and fund school departments? Let's start with how cities generate revenue. While the federal government utilizes the income tax, and most states tax income and sales, cities and towns collect their revenue through the property tax. The property tax is the most significant source of revenue for cities and towns. The city assesses the value of your property and applies the tax rate to it to determine how much money you owe. If your home is assessed at $100,000 and the property tax rate is 2%, then you would owe your local government $2,000 annually. That's for a home, but what about a commercial building? Most cities and towns tax commercial buildings at a higher rate than residential properties. This tax is applied to office buildings, industrial sites, and retail stores. Generally speaking, a multi-family residential building with 5 or more units is taxed at that commercial rate, which is higher, and residential buildings with 4 units or less are usually taxed at the residential tax rate. The property tax makes up almost 100% of the tax revenue to most municipalities across the United States. However, some cities have additional taxes. While almost every state collects a sales tax, some cities and towns also collect a sales tax. In the state of New York, the state sales tax is 4%, where the city of New York's sales tax is 4.5%, resulting in an effective tax rate of 8.5%. Some cities impose a third tax, the income tax. Most people are familiar with the federal government's income tax, and you're probably familiar with a state income tax too, as all but 7 states also tax income. But some cities and towns also impose an income tax. 17 states allow cities, counties, and municipalities to levy their own individual income tax in addition to the state income tax. Fees for applications and licenses are also an additional line item of revenue for cities and towns, although this is a much smaller percentage of revenue for cities and towns. But when you apply for a permit or a license or anything that's more specific to you and your property and not as much the city or town at large, there's usually some type of application fee associated with that request. Most cities and towns also receive some form of state aid from their state government. A lot of times this state aid is to fund education. So we know how cities and towns generate revenue. It's through the property tax, it's sometimes through a sales tax, and also sometimes through an income tax, as well as generating fees and some form of state aid. But what do they need this money for, and what do they spend this money on? The main expenditures for local governments are on police, fire, and school departments, and really the people who provide these services. As in business, labor is usually one of the most significant costs to a business, and the same is true in government. In some cases, the education budget is almost half the city or town's budget. But as cities get larger and larger, the top 50 largest U.S. cities, they have entire departments that most smaller cities and towns don't have across the United States, so that percentage of the education budget is less in the larger metropolitan areas. Some cities also have a capital improvement plan or a capital budget. They would use their capital budget to make large capital purchases that aren't in a typical operational budget annually. If a department needs to buy a new vehicle, like a new plow truck, or a public building needs to purchase a new roof, that would usually be funded through a capital budget because it's a one-time large capital expenditure. For a project so expensive that a city would need to borrow money for, like the building of a new multi-million-dollar school, a city would issue a bond. Before that city can issue the bond, before the city can borrow money, they need authorization from voters. So bonds are placed on a ballot during an election or a special election is held to see if voters are going to authorize that city or town to borrow funds for that particular project. Some ways municipal finance differs from federal government finance is that, one, cities can't print money, and two, cities can't run a deficit the way the federal government can. So cities and towns are only authorized to spend what is in their budget. If the city or town generates more revenue in the form of fees that were more than they had originally expected, they're not authorized to spend that money unless it was authorized in the budget. Many of the expenditures of local government are demanded by the citizens. They want school departments, they want police departments, they want fire departments, they want public parks, roads, water, and sewer systems. And these things cost millions of dollars. People often say you should run a city like a business, but as we've just discussed, city governments are less nimble than private sector businesses. They're inherently different. Cities and towns don't generate new and innovative products to raise revenue and increase profits. That's not their function or their role. What cities do is provide public safety and infrastructure where it makes sense to have a public monopoly. Think of things like road systems and a police department. Whereas businesses are creating new services and new products for consumers. They're private companies. They're more nimble, and they're not accountable to every single resident and property owner in the city. If you're interested in local government finance, Google your city or town's budget. These budgets are usually very publicly accessible, and you'll be able to see how your local government generates revenue and what they're spending it on. And if you're interested in cities, government, and economics, subscribe for more videos.